Bill Ray. You good-looking guy, you.
I'd have to say it was Arkansas, I don't know.
No, we're talking countries.
Well,
What country?
what country?
Yes. Anybody have an idea on that?
I don't know.
Sweden.
Sweden?
In 1766, Sweden passes the first FOIA law. What was the second? France. The French Declaration of Rights of Man allows citizens to review the government's expenditures. That was 1789. We were third. America was third. In what year?
1967.
Well, that's Arkansas.
Oh, you're talking about nations?
America was third, but what year? 1966. Which is, you know, you see those 1700s.
Well, I only missed it 1 year.
You did. I thought you were somebody. I thought you had been reading my notes there for a minute.
I wonder if Governor Rockefeller would have picked up on that, Mike, in 1966. He really pushed it in 1966 and got it passed.
I'm sure that he did. Governor Bill Ray was commenting that we passed our Arkansas legislation in February of 1967, the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act. One interesting fact about our U.S. measure, the Freedom of Information Act, President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, did not approve of the act. Although he signed it, he was never a supporter of the Freedom of Information Act. And the act, as it originally was passed, was not a success. And guess what? When it became a success? 1974, Mike. You know what happened in 1974? The First Amendment to the law. Watergate. Yep. So Watergate. All right. Just some kind of facts about it, and pay attention. Stephen Naparano of my office came up with these quotes. I love the first one, and actually Professor Steinbuck's book, what we call the FOIA Bible, kind of has this quote in it about sunshine is the best disinfectant. The best disinfectant for the coronavirus is soap and to wash your hands. The best disinfectant for corruption is government transparency and open records. Nothing more true. With that said, I want to introduce to you a friend of mine and a friend of ours. Someone who routinely in his columns writes about the Freedom of Information Act, and that's Mike Masterson. Just enough can't be said about Mike. He writes about FOIA repeatedly, and his readership is unbelievable. People follow Mike, and we're so appreciative of Mike and how he insists on open government. With that said, I'm going to give you Mike Masterson.
Good afternoon. In preparation for this, Bill Ray asked me to speak for 30 minutes, and I promised to keep it at least at that. And whenever I speak to groups, I try to follow the adage, talk about what you know about. I didn't come to talk about the law itself today. I mean, look at Professor of the Authority in Arkansas will be right behind me. So I just wanted to share with you some of the instances that I've been through over the years that began, let me grab this. That began with my very first job in journalism. And in Hot Springs, when I was editor there, the school board would not give us information we needed. So for the first time ever, we filed an FOI request. It involves student disciplinary matters. And the school board claimed that the students were employees. We said, no, they're not your employees at all. And so we took it to court, and we won that case. And I realized then that, you know, this law is not only important, but it's one that is vital to not only our society, but to what we do as journalists. And as time went on, there in Hot Springs, I'm not sure how many times we used it, but it was a law. And it was always successful. We didn't lose any cases. And from there, I realized that I went to the LA Times from there as a reporter. And I realized as I started writing about all the cases became involved in there during my time, that the FOI law was going to open a lot of doors for me, and it did. I remember at Torrey Pines Golf Course, one of the premier golf courses and a public course in our country, some reporters and I would play golf there regularly, but we never could get tee times in the morning. We couldn't figure out why, because we'd start calling for a reservation right on the moment that we could, and it was already full in the morning. And so during one afternoon when we finally got to play again, I went up to the starter, and the person who keeps time or keeps record of who's going off when, and I asked him if he kept records of who went off when for the last 3 months. And he said he did. So, and this is one thing about FOI law and FOI cases. I asked if he had a piece of paper, and he did. And so I stood there and wrote out an FOI request right there for the logs for the last 3 months, the starting logs. Well, he pulled them together in a couple of days. I went back. And lo and behold, believe it or not, it's the same groups at the same time on a public course, weekend after weekend. So they didn't even start until the afternoon. Anybody else had a chance to get in. So I wrote the story that this same group of people were taking these times every weekend. One of the things that I'd asked the starter at the time was, after I saw that, I said, well, do you know these people? And he said, well, yeah, I know the guys. I know them. Have you become friends with them? Well, yeah. They'll give you gifts. You know, Christmas, do you get a little bottle of whatever you like best or something else? And he said, well, yeah, at Christmas they give us gifts. So to make a long story short, the story appeared in the Times, and within a week, the whole thing was completely switched around. Finally, people could get back on and want to play golf in the morning on the weekend, other than this group. And that just reinforced what I knew the whole time, that this law is so critical, because had I not had that, he would not have given me those records. And because I did, the whole system changed. And I credit the FOI law beyond myself for having that done. In another case in LA, a young man was murdered. I FOI'd the prosecutor's office for the records. It showed that they had gotten the case in their investigation completely wrong. And so I wrote that story, saying how this young man actually died rather than why they weren't filing charges, because they thought it was an accident. Well, all of a sudden, within 2 days, they had to back up and file charges against this young man that killed him. And he was convicted and sentenced for involuntary manslaughter. From there, I went to Chicago. In Chicago, they play hardball, by the way, the system for sure in every way. I was reading about a young black man who had hanged himself, supposedly, in one of the police lockups. There were a dozen police lockups in Chicago. And he'd been running from the police, and they arrested him on some relatively minor charge, a misdemeanor. And the next day he was dead. He was 21 years old. So I wondered, how many of these deaths do they have in Chicago? And so I FOI'd that to the police department, asking how many they'd had in the last 2 years and which lockups. And it came back, and even I was amazed because it was more than the combined total of New York and LA in that one community, that one city. So I wrote that story, and next thing you know, other people are coming forward. And before it was over, the police department was having to call, the police commissioner was having to call a press conference and announce major reforms in the way they handled the people they arrested, especially young black men. And so the thing that happened with George Floyd obviously had been going on for a long time, everywhere, not just in Minnesota. Dixon, Illinois housed the largest, I had 5,000 patients, developmentally disabled, sorry. And we heard that they've been dropping their population, but we didn't understand why. So we went to Dixon and looked. I came back and wrote an FOIA request to the state and discovered in the process, because of that FOI request, that indeed the population had been dwindling. And what they've been doing was busing these poor, developmentally disabled people who were in Dixon, who were cared for by a staff that understood how to care for developmentally disabled, into nursing homes around Chicago owned by big political contributors. And the big political contributors wanted those patients to fill their beds so they could get the Medicaid funds. And they've been doing that for about 2 years when we discovered, the population is going down in Dixon. And what they were doing was, at the same time, through another FOI request, we learned that they'd been applying to the Department of Justice to turn Dixon into a prison. So they were installing all these things connected with the prison that you would expect to see, cells and cell doors and fencing and wiring. And so they were slowly converting Dixon into a prison while quietly putting these poor people in these horrible nursing homes. They were some of the worst. But they got them because they were contributing money to the politicians, and nothing was particularly new about that, especially in Chicago. And I found one case that I pursued in the group of hundreds that had been done and distributed, of a young woman who had been moved into one of the homes, and she had died of bed sore infections, where she had been treated really well in Dixon. Now she was dead. She was in her 20s, early 20s. So I took what I learned from FOI information around that case into a story for the Sun-Times, and blew the whole thing open about what the state was doing quietly, converting Dixon into a prison. And these people were dying. This woman was a good example, this young lady. Her name is Donna Sonnenberg, I remember. And I wrote about her case and the details around her death. And that led to the arrest of, and first conviction, really in Illinois, of a nursing home owner for abuse, criminal abuse. So that was just 2 examples in Chicago, and there were a bunch. When I got back to Arkansas, I came back to do investigations for the Daily papers of Waco Media, owned by Walter Husband, the Arkansas Democrat at that time. Now they don't practice that. But anyway, I was traveling around the state and doing stories for all the papers and some major investigations into what was going on in Arkansas. One of the cases I got onto was the Marvin Williams case early on. Marvin Williams was a young black man who had died 20 years earlier in Conway in the Butler County Jail, arrested by 2 white police officers. And Marvin had, he was arrested supposedly for being so intoxicated in his car that he couldn't even walk and they had to carry him. And the 2 officers had testified. Let me back up. When I looked at this, I knew that it had been a coroner's inquest. So I FOI'd the coroner's inquest and got about 40 pages of it. And in the inquest, we could see who said what under oath. The 2 officers and others involved in the case at the time. Of what had happened to Marvin, they said, these 2 men, these 2 police officers, they had seen Marvin in his car, and it was raining, and he was obviously intoxicated, so they took him in, and taking him in, they accidentally dropped him. One on each, they had him in the middle, and his arms around each shoulder. And there was a clap of thunder, and all of a sudden he fell forward and hit his forehead. And that's why pictures later that I also got through FOI. But that's how, that was the cause of his death. No, but that wasn't what happened. What really happened was that once I got him in the cell block upstairs, he was seen by a white inmate over across the way being beaten by the 2 officers, savagely beaten. He was on the floor and they were hitting him. Then they dragged him into the woman's cell on the other side. They didn't want to put him in the cell of the men over here, but he was watching this. And it turned out that Marvin was dead the next morning, and then an autopsy was done. And the coroner's inquest was impaneled, but they didn't wait for the autopsy results. They ruled that it was an accidental death. By now, though, armed with that the coroner's inquest, I started moving ahead, asking other questions, trying to find out everything I could what happened 20 years, this is 20 years later. I started issuing FOI requests of the medical examiner's office, the coroner's office in Conway, Butler County. And anyway, before it was over, I don't know how many stories I wrote using FOI. Bill Clinton, who was governor at the time, the pressure had built so high on all the lies that had been told and exposed that he impaneled, he called for a special prosecutor who impaneled a grand jury. And they called these 2 officers in. One had become a truck driver since, and the other one was high-ranking in the state police in Arkansas. They left Conway, obviously, and moved on after 20 years. They called them in to testify, and this went on for 3 weeks. The special prosecutor, Gary Isbell from Yellville, he was in a wheelchair, he rolled his wheelchair through the black part of Conway, trying to get people to talk to him and earn their trust so that they could come and testify at the grand jury what they knew. And before it was over, they indicted those 2 men for first-degree murder 20 years later. And probably 4 months later, the trial was held. And it was a classic, just about what you'd expect. On one side of the courtroom were blacks praying for justice, and on the other side were whites who were supporting the 2 police officers. And the testimony was given, and when it was over, they were set free. Well, a lot of truth had emerged during that time. And I had promised the father of Marvin at that time, when I started looking into it, that I wouldn't even open it up unless he gave me his blessing, because I didn't want to open this wound, tear the scab off this 20-year-old injury for them unless they wanted me to, and he had. So it all wrapped up with that exoneration of the 2 officers. And I might say, too, that as of next week, Ronnie Williams, which is Marvin's younger brother, has completed his book on this case called Markham Street. And it's going to be circulated nationwide, and it's going to be in all the Walmart supercenters. And on March 30th at the Clinton Library, Ronnie Williams is reading from his book and doing a book signing. I plan to be down there too. Either his family's now gone, his mom and dad. But without the FOI, I would never have gotten the coroner's inquest and a lot of the other information I was able to get in that case that went on for a year before it finally ended. But you know, I was so discouraged at that point that although I was born here and loved the state, I just wanted to leave because I just had this, it was so obvious what had happened to Marvin. You know, this jury, all-white jury, had set these men free, that I was offered a job at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix to head their investigative team. So I moved to Phoenix, headed that team. My predecessor there had been murdered with a car bomb 10 years earlier, and they disbanded their investigative team at that time. Now they were reopening it. So they brought me in to reform their investigative unit and start looking into what's going on in Phoenix. And I can tell you Phoenix was about as hardball as Chicago. And one of the first steps that I took there was to FOI all the information around the death of my predecessor, Don Bowles, who'd been murdered with a car bomb at a hotel. The last thing they had from Don Bowles was a note on his desk that he was supposed to meet with a source at a hotel in downtown, the Clarendon Hotel in downtown Phoenix. And he went, well, the source never showed up, he got back in his car and exploded. So someone had put a bomb under it and killed him. That time he'd been looking at land fraud in Arizona, which was rampant. May still be, I don't know, but. So one of the first things I did was issue FOIAs on everything I could find about the Bowles case. 2 men were later convicted of that. I don't think they ever got to the top, the real people that orchestrated his murder. But Barry Goldwater, at that time was a senator, and he'd endorsed one of these fraudulent land companies that Don Bowles had been looking into. So whether Goldwater had anything to do with it or not, I think if I had to guess or bet the house, I'd say that it went all the way up to his office of what happened to Don, stopped him from looking at what he was looking at. But we were able to put a lot more information out about his murder, and 2 men were eventually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. We did a series on mistreating the American Indians in Arizona. It took us almost a year to do it. And I don't know, I lost track of how many FOIs we issued, but it enabled us to put together a 32-page special report on how the Indians have been abused in so many ways, from education to Indian Health Service to slant drilling on oil drilling on the reservations. And that led to Senate hearings and a lot of changes in the way the Indians were being treated at that time. Joey, give me the sign when it's 30 minutes. Right? Is it?
Which sign is that?
That just wing.